pleasure to be here with Yinka, who I think is one of the world's leading artists dealing with issues of post-colonial identity, identity more generally, and working in a really broad range of medium to kind of pursue these ideas, I think, from painting, sculpture, filmmaking, printmaking, in gallery contexts, in public contexts, on the sides of buildings. I mean, quite an amazing vocabulary that he's developed kind of single-mindedly through the course of his career. He was nominated for the Turner Prize in the past. He's been one of the stars of the Venice Biennale, and I think it particularly worth saying that he was commissioned by the late Okwi Enwezo for to do a piece at Documenta Gallantry and Criminal Conversation back in 2002, which is one of the iconic works I think he's going to show us tonight. The way this is going to work is that Yinka's going to do a short presentation to introduce, I guess, the narrative arc of his practice, and then we'll discuss some themes that arise from what he does. So Yinka, over to you.
Well, thanks for having me. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about my my career path and also the things that sort of inspired my practice. I guess my practice kind of started in the sort of late 80s, and now there are many sort of black artists who are quite visible and doing stuff. At the time, the whole question of identity was something that a lot of people were kind of exploring. And in the US, you had the feminist movement. So I grew up with people like Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, Mapplethorpe. Those were the kind of artists I was looking at. And then in Britain, there was the Black Art movement. So Eddie Chambers, Keith Piper, also exploring those sort of identity issues. There was a show at the Haywood Gallery curated by Rashid Irin called The Other Story. And Rashid Irin also published a magazine called Third Text. Now, the idea of Third Text really, Third Text started to look at this idea that contemporary art, international art, should actually be inclusive and include the global South. There was a show at the Pompidou, I think it was, called Magicien de la Terre. And that was actually the first show in which artists from Africa and other, India and so on, were actually shown as kind of being, part of the kind of global artwork. But then there was a kind of ethnographic approach to that display. So people like Okwi Enwezo then did Documenta. And the idea of Documenta was to actually show global art, but on an equal footing. And so I was in Documenta. I was also in Sensation, that was at the Royal Academy. So kind of, young British artists. So a lot of my contemporaries were people like, Tracy Emin, Sarah Lucas, Jake and Dinos Chapman, and that kind of generation. And Charles Saatchi was the first to actually, start buying our works. And so I'll go to the beginning and show the first. Okay, so I had a very sort of academic career, just in terms of life drawing, painting, and so on. Then in my second year at college, I started to really question, just looking at ideas of identity in the practice. But I was also very interested in global politics. So I was making works about perestroika in Russia, so the changes going on in Russia at the time. And so one of my tutors said, well, why aren't you producing authentic African art? Now, I grew up in Lagos, and Lagos is a very the crazy city. You know, I grew up, so, you know, watching Sesame Street and that kind of thing. But the tutor wanted me to produce kind of ethnic African art, but as a kind of contemporary African, I wasn't. You know, of course, I'm interested in my heritage, but at the same time, I'm also a kind of, you know, modern kind of contemporary African. So on this question of authenticity, you know, what is authentic English art? You know, should an authentic English artist make work about Morris dancing, or should they make work, you know, so what is that? And I went to a shop in Brixton Market, and I found the, you know, the batik fabrics. And then, you know, we started talking about it, and then I was told, well, the fabrics are Indonesian-influenced fabrics produced by the Dutch, and then sold. Well, first they tried to sell the fabrics in Indonesia, the factory-produced fabrics in Indonesia, and they were not so popular there, and they tried West Africa. And the fabrics are also made in West Africa now, and they're made in China, mostly now as well. But I thought the fabrics are this kind of very interesting metaphor, you know, about, you know, the relationship between Europe and Africa. But also because of my own training in, you know, in art history, I wanted to actually decontextualize the fabrics in a way, kind of bring the fabrics from the market into the kind of, you know, into the gallery space. And so that's the first painting I made using the fabrics, and that eventually actually went into the Charles Saatchi collection, but it's no longer in that collection. But can we go to the next one? And then I started to actually incorporate, you know, the actual context of the gallery. So the wall becomes part of the painting, and then the singular abstract painting, you know, it's got pattern and fabric, and then it's kind of fragmented into this kind of little pieces. Good, goodness. And then some of them I'll just go through fairly quickly. Just slow down a bit. So that's just kind of, you know, going through. So I'm kind of taking you through how the work's kind of evolved. Okay, yeah, the next. And so if we stop here for a bit, that's the first costume piece I made. So at this time, I was also, at the same time, encountering post-colonial theory. So I was looking at, there were people like Edward Said, Orientalism, which is the book I read at the time, and, you know, Homi Bhabha, and also Stuart Hall. A lot of people just sort of writing, looking at the power relationship between, you know, the West and also the kind of colonized countries. I'm trying to, you know, as that's kind of my own background, trying to define my own place in all that. You know, what's the impact of the colonial era on, you know, on an artist of African origin? And so, and then I started what I describe as, you know, ethnicizing the aristocracy. So I sort of started to take, you know, the clothes of the, you know, of the aristocracy of the time, who would have been the colonizers, and again, deconstructing them. And so using the fabrics to do that. And that's another piece I made, you know, kind of, again, making interventions into kind of aristocratic settings. Okay, next one. And so this is a painting that at the National Gallery by Gainsborough. And so the painting shows, you know, a couple outside of their estates. And so I sort of did a twist with the painting, and the painting is made into the sculpture, and that the original painting is called Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And so this is called, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews without their heads. So the earlier sculptures, I kind of took the heads off. And that's a kind of reference to the French Revolution and the guillotine when I started to do that. So it's a form of protest, but in a kind of subtle way. Well, not so subtle, but anyway. Yeah. And so this is the swing after Fragonard. And I showed this piece actually when I was nominated for the Turner at the Tate. And the piece actually now belongs to the Tate, so it was acquired by the Tate. Okay, yeah. And so this is the piece I did for Documenta. And I was actually reading about the Grand Tour at the time. And then I found out that actually, the Grand Tour was meant to be this kind of, cultural experience where people went, traveled around Europe in the 18th century to experience culture. But I also read about how sexually kind of liberating it was. People were away from home and they got into all kinds of things. So so I made this work about that. The work was also about kind of tourism and the kind of exploitation that can come with that sometimes. Okay, can we go to the next one? And Scramble for Africa is a reimagining of when Africa was actually partitioned into countries, and the people were not really asked about, if they actually wanted, their continent to be divided up into countries. That 14 European nations came together at the Berlin Conference, and they shared Africa out amongst themselves, and so they created these artificial countries. But unfortunately, as a result of that, there are still conflicts on the ground because people found themselves in the same country who actually didn't have any other kind of relationship other than the lines that the European countries kind of drew in the sand. So this is a sort of a way of kind of reimagining that conference. Okay, can we go? Okay, yeah, so, and then what I'll do is we'll go through some of the slides, and then we'll see, if we want to trigger a conversation from there. Okay, so just go to the next one. And so this is a commission that was done for 14 to 18 now to commemorate the First World War. And so this is my first kind of kinetic piece, so that actually it moves. And each person on the seesaw represents, each side of the conflict.
Yeah, and two particular empires as well.
Yeah, two particular empires, yes. And that was shown in Margate, Turner Contemporary.
And these ones have kind of heads of a sort.
Yeah, they have kind of globes.
Yeah.
And
but is that ironic in a way?
Well, it's more about trying to, because a lot of the figures are actually of mixed heritage, and they are, they represent humanity, if you like. So not one kind of specific kind of race. Yeah. I wanted to kind of move beyond the kind of, very specific racial thing.
Yeah. But I guess it's kind of about power as well in this work, and I think for me it's interesting to have the globe heads because that's precisely what the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the British Franco Empire is about to lose as a result of the First World War.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
And I was wondering while we were talking about that, I mean, you use history a lot, both art history and political and economic and sociological history.
Yeah.
To what extent, I mean, there's some people who might say the past is another country, they do things differently there. But to what extent do you think we're really formed by, I guess, an arc of history that in your work goes from the Enlightenment, so a sort of death of God, through to the death of empire and through to whatever mess is left over?
No, I think that's a very good point. I actually think that a lot of, things happen to people and they don't quite understand why those things are happening to them. But there are kind of a lot of historical reasons for that. You know, I mean, I'm a result of the British Empire, you know, and so it's very important to understand the legacy of those things. You know, a lot of the stuff happening in the Middle East now probably wouldn't be happening if the Second World War hadn't happened. Yeah. You know, so there's a kind of a link. And I think that it's also easier to do something poetic and reflective if you take, you know, if you take history into account. And I find that history is already, you know, there's so many things going on now that it's, I prefer to use metaphors because it's very difficult to kind of unravel exactly what's going on or where it's actually going to end.
And I think, I mean, for example, my mother's was a British subject, born, and was born in Malaysia, but is Sri Lankan ethnically, identifies with neither of them. We went on a moving holiday to the ancestral home in Jaffna in January. She got there, we're expecting weeping, maybe the red earth is picked up in her hands, and she gets there and she goes, oh, well, it doesn't really mean anything to me, I only came here a couple of times. It's a bit dirty, isn't it? And I think for some people an amnesiac position is more helpful in terms of, I guess, integrating in a way.
But then there is no, I actually feel that in terms of your self-esteem, it's very important to continue to acknowledge your own history. Because you can then, you know, you get self-esteem from that. You know where your ancestors are from. And, you know, rather than actually, you know, trying to be another type of person that you're historically not. And then you fail at doing that because you're not. You know what I mean?
But equally, there are also lots of possible selves.
No, absolutely. And I think in a way, what you say about possible selves is more or less what my work's about, because it's about that process of hybridization. It's about the fact that we actually have to accept that the kind of the binary narrative is kind of not something that we, you know, want to push. You know, I actually challenge the kind of the whole idea of the binary narrative. You know, so you're either or. And I don't think in a contemporary, you know, in the contemporary world we live in, you know, you have one personality when you're at home, you have another one when you're, you know, when you're professional, you have, and then, you know, you want to experience, especially now, you know, you want to experience aspects of different cultures. And so, and I think most discrimination comes with the idea of fixing people into one kind of stereotype. And then the whole kind of, you know, post-structuralist theory, which is what I encountered also, you know, in the early part of my career, where the actual representation itself is what, you know, it's representation itself that gets, you know, challenged. And how you represent things. And, you know, I was very interested in kind of semiotics in the early part of my career. And, you know, the idea that what you represent something with is not necessarily the thing that you're representing that thing with. So, you know, so there's that thing of, you know, Magritte's pipe. You know, so you have a picture of you have a picture of a pipe, and then Magritte writes under it, you know, this is not a pipe. So in other words, a picture of a pipe is not a pipe, in the sense that, you know, it's just lines and paint on a piece of canvas or whatever. And so you cannot, so it's not, that picture is not intrinsically the pipe. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Thanks. But I think to relate it back to your work, there's a way, and then maybe I'm going to, as a shorthand, to accuse it of your painterly training, being responsible for it, where a lot of your work has a lot of action going on the surface, and then these concepts and ideas bubbling in underneath, but it doesn't seem to insist on either of them as being a dominant form.
No, not necessarily. But also, it's very important. I mean, one aspect, you know, people do talk about the content of the work, and they talk about the kind of, you know, post-colonial references. But I actually think that the poetic is a very important aspect of my practice. You know,
and beauty as well.
Beauty, yeah, and but you see, beauty and to some extent humor,
yeah,
as well. And I think that you know, I feel that the kind of the tactile and the visual are kind of very important, even when one is actually exploring kind of, you know, dark subjects.
Yeah, which this is.
Yes.
Maybe you could explain a bit more about this work, because it refers to a particular event.
Yes, so, I mean, this is, you know, Mrs. Pinckney and the Emancipated Birds of South Carolina. So there was, this work was actually shown at, as part of an exhibition at Kensington Palace. And so there was a kind of a wealthy American lady. She'd been taught how to make indigo by her slaves. And then she created a big business out of that. And then she came to the UK and she met the Queen. And we're talking like 18th century.
Yeah.
And she, so she talks about, you know, her slaves actually, you know, teaching her how to make indigo. But what I liked about that story was the fact that, you know, she was given agency at that time to the people who were her slaves.
Yeah.
So they were not, you know, like passive slaves. And it was kind of unusual at that time. And so I was commissioned by Yale Center for British Art to actually make a commission around that story. And so I, you know, so I did this based on one of the ladies' dresses, actually.
Yeah.
And I made this work and balanced on the way that the world map looked at the time. And then her slaves, they were kind of this escaped, because she brought gifts of birds to the Queen. And so I made those birds into a metaphor for the slaves kind of escaping. They're kind of outside of the cage.
Mm. But at the same time, the cage is still there.
Yes, the cage is there.
Because I think this is one of the interesting things.
But they're outside of the cage.
With your work, but there is a kind of ambivalence to it, because at any point, those hands could put them back in.
Yeah, but, you know. Yes. No, I mean, it's kind of... Because, you see, that's the thing with the poetic thing, is that there are different levels of interpretation. And I prefer things to be kind of a bit more kind of open-ended.
Yeah.
Not necessarily completely fixed.
And that allows for the humour in the work.
Yes, and also it allows for the audience to interpret, you know, the work based on their own kind of subjectivity.
Yeah. And you happy for them to do that, however wild
Oh,
it
no,
goes?
absolutely, because it's not, you know, I mean, it's not a formula.
Yeah.
You know.
And I want to come back to the humour, maybe, because most of the students I meet, if I'm teaching, their main thing is they want to be taken seriously. None of them say, I want not to be taken seriously, I want to be funny. It's a very difficult thing to do as an artist, particularly when you're dealing with issues that conjure up such emotions and histories and struggles. Is that something you find difficult to balance? And
well, I mean, I think the history of colonialism and slavery, it's such a horrific history that you have to, you know, you have to find a kind of humorous way into it.
Yeah.
You know, because also the last thing you want to do is kind of switch your audience off completely. You know, you want people to engage with the work, so you have to find ways.
But do you see part of your role as to engage through entertainment?
Oh no, I mean, I think art is entertainment.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's part of it. You know, it's not only entertainment, but I think it's part of,
But you feel a need to sort of grab the audience rather than...
Well, I mean, I think that, you see, what I prefer to do is to create different levels. Actually, can we stop it there for a second? So it's to create layered points, layered entry points. So you first see something, and then as you peel back, you start to discover that actually it's more than the surface that you're looking at.
Yeah.
Because, for example, when I started doing the classical sculptures, I'd always known that classical sculptures originally they were painted.
Yeah.
They were not, they were not white marble sculptures. And that's, my work does link to current affairs and things going on. And then the alt-right in the US started using, the classical sculptures as a way of celebrating kind of Aryan culture, but they were often kind of white marble sculptures that they were using on their images. And then I discovered that a German historian called Johann Winkelmann, he was the one who actually established the notion that white classical sculpture meant, the superiority of the Aryan race. Mm-hmm. And so he promoted this notion that actually classical sculpture was always white.
Yeah.
And then, so what I'm doing with these works is to actually, because we know that notion then also, because I also, if you go back, so Adolf Hitler, he actually owned a discourse drawer. And I felt that those ideas have very, very serious, historical consequences. And so that's why I kind of reappropriated those classical sculptures, and I started to kind of, make them colorful. And also knowing that actually, human culture, like, Greek culture, Roman culture, Egyptian culture, there are kind of influences that people take from each other and then they make something.
Yeah.
But the notion of the kind of Aryan superiority was based on the idea of the autonomy of each culture, which I thought was kind of totally wrong and a misunderstanding of human culture generally. And so those works sort of evolved out of that.
And I guess a really cruel person would say that the Nazis are what comes out of starting a culture that's invented by artists that becomes a country. So Goethe, Schiller, Wagner, Winkelmann very much construct a myth of what Germany is.
Yes. Yeah.
And then that just goes off in kind of all kinds of directions.
Yes, but then you see, one can't really necessarily blame artists because dictators somehow appropriate what artists do, and people appropriate culture for their own, to their own ends.
Yeah. Well, as you're doing.
Yeah. No, exactly. But then if you're, if you're a dictator and you're using the arts, in the case of the way that, Hitler, for example, used, Roman kind of culture as a way to kind of push those agendas of kind of the superiority of the Aryan race, which, and I think that, so it's important to understand where, just where racism comes from.
Yeah.
And to sort of start to unpick that. But then I want to unpick that through some kind of collective memory or something that people actually can identify with, and then deconstruct those kind of iconic images.
But in a way, you're kind
oppression.
of setting it up to knock it down.
Well, in a way, yeah.
Now maybe we can talk a bit about the fabric pieces, because these have evolved into public sculptures.
Yes, exactly. And so that's a bronze piece. It's a painted bronze.
Yeah.
And again, just looking at the form of sculpture, and usually public sculpture is usually, well, sometimes they're kind of equestrian sculpture there. And the first public sculpture I did was Nelson's Ship in a Bottle in Trafalgar Square.
I think we can skip.
And so with Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, I was kind of, that's it. So I had the sails, and that's HMS Victory. And Trafalgar Square, of course, it's called Trafalgar Square because of the Battle of Trafalgar. And Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar. And that victory actually enabled the British Empire to expand because of access to the seas.
Yeah.
And Napoleon was kind of kept back. And after doing that piece, I was looking at the sails, because I'd swapped the sails, for the fabric. And then I thought actually it might be more interesting to look at the fabric itself and create that sculpture out of the kind of fabric. But then also, sculpture is usually kind of mass and kind of big, and I wanted to make something heavy, but to make it look really light.
Yeah.
And it's kind of made out of fiberglass. And so that's how the wind sculptures actually evolved. So can we see some of the next? Yeah, so, and this is actually in London, in Harwick Place, so not too far from Victoria Station. And so that's the first kind of wind sculpture that I installed. And then I did one also in Central Park in New York. That's Yorkshire Sculpture Park.
And these move away from a direct reference to the body, which is a sort of change in terms of
yes, but I guess the reference to the body there, you might say scale.
Yeah.
Might be, a kind of reference. But they still carry the same kind of history of the work and the history of the fabrics, but they're kind of, I suppose they're much more sort of, exuberant, and they're also questioning actually what sculpture might be.
Yeah.
Because, within the public realm, traditionally or historically anyway, public sculpture has been sort of figurative or, big and heavy things. And so I wanted to actually, and also color, it's to actually put color in the public realm as well. Because not many, sculptors do it. I mean, a few people like Calder and a few people. But, and I wanted to do that, so, yeah.
But they also seem to capture this idea of trade and trade winds. And
exactly, trade winds and, kind of travel across oceans, migration.
Yeah, and imply a certain insubstantiality. That kind of is the opposite of traditional sculpture. I mean, because all the public sculptures in London say are actually private, or privately commissioned through private funds.
Yes.
Because the state here never commissioned anything until quite recently.
Yes, but also I think it's very important to have, things that I think contemporary people can kind of identify with, and it's also avoiding kind of, ideology in the sculpture. It's not trying to make you do anything or, say anything. It's kind of, just,
you might wonder where the pattern comes from.
It's just fun,
But do you think people approach contemporary art like that? As just fun?
Well, I mean, some people don't, but I do. I mean, I think it's, I think the work should be, even when the work is serious, I think, it's also, I want the audience to engage with it.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to put people off,
And how do you think the change in scale in the work, has that been something you've really enjoyed? Has it been difficult?
I mean, I think, again, art is about context.
Yeah.
And if I feel this, this works is suited to, sculpture parks or, public spaces. And, I mean, I've enjoyed actually, dealing with that scale. I mean, the one I'm working on now is going to be 10 meters tall. Right. And the one I just did for Central, actually, can you go? Did we see that one? The one in Central Park?
Not yet.
So that's the one, and that's about 7 meters tall. And, and it's fun to just see people, looking at the work. And
you implied earlier that there wasn't a specific meaning being offered by these works.
Well, I mean, obviously, there is a questioning of sculpture. There's what is sculpture?
Yeah.
What is, and also, so there are different levels of meaning. Some people might just see them as kind of fun, colorful things. Or some people might want to understand the history of the fabric. Some people might want to understand actually the material, the materiality, the fact that it's painted fiberglass, made to look, like it's sort of floating.
Yeah.
So some people are very interested in, the formal qualities of sculpture, might be interested in those aspects of it. So there is a formal aspect as well as a kind of conceptual.
At the same time, particularly in the US and even here, how and why certain sculptures got into position and what they represent is such a hot topic, particularly with people involved with slavery or colonialism. That is it reasonable to expect that people aren't going to at least think, why is this here? And
no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, obviously, some people would think that, but then, my experience showing this, because it's a project I did with the Public Art Fund in New York,
yeah,
and they do a lot of public sculpture around New York. But the experience was, was very positive. I think people kind of just liked seeing, color and a fun piece, in Central Park, so. But you'll never make anything that everyone is going to approve of 100%. But at least it's good to make that sort of intervention that's a bit different from what you would normally have.
Yeah, which could lead us back to the dandy photos.
Oh yes, actually those would be my first public works because they were on the London Underground. Yeah, those, yeah. So those were, you can more or less guess my age now, because I did those in 1998.
You've aged well.
And there were huge posters on the London Underground, about 40 sites on the London Underground. And people couldn't figure out what they were, like, was that a film, or did that guy actually exist? And they're based on Hogarth's Rake's Progress. And, just did this shoot where I kind of dressed as a dandy and then different times of the day.
Yeah.
Again, when you look at sort of older paintings, and you look at, Hogarth, or whenever you saw a black person in the picture, they were usually a valet or some kind of subservient kind of character. So it's more about taking control of my own sort of representation or historical representation.
But also working with a narrative that may or may not be present, but at least a suggestion.
Well, yes, I mean, there's a kind of suggestion. And, I think just putting those images out in the world, you're kind of, in a way, I mean, you could almost describe it as sort of rewriting history or rewriting your own history.
Yeah. And you've rewritten the history in a way because you've taken something from the 18th century, displaced it to the 19th century.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's kind of been, taking charge of your own sort of representation.
And how does it feel when you are literally represented in the work as opposed to when you're not? Does it feel really different? Do you get self-conscious at all?
Well, I mean, again, it's sort of, you're playing a role. So it's kind of role play. You're acting, aren't you?
Yeah.
And
but again, I guess there's a suggestion that because you're in it, it's somehow more authentic.
Well,
even if we know you're acting, you're still in it, and we know it's you.
Yes, I mean, but it's a form of kind of, because as you know, history is the biggest form of fake theater.
Yeah.
You know that. So you might as well take control of your own history and write your own. Write your own fake theatre, if you like.
Yeah, but in a way, I guess all history is written in the present, not the past, and constantly
No,
revised.
absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I think that's one of the interesting things in your work is that history becomes such a fluid thing that can be recontextualized, displaced, kind of remixed in lots
No,
of
no,
ways.
absolutely. I mean, it's a form of mythology. And, but then that mythology also becomes a tool of oppression as well, as you know.
Yeah.
And, so as an artist, what you're doing is you're actually rewriting your own history.
Yeah. I guess the question is that more fun than rewriting general history?
Well, as an artist anyway, your strongest point is to know how to be a good liar. And if you're not a good liar, you can't be an artist.
Ah. So if you're an artist and we've been having this conversation, how many times have you been lying tonight?
Well, probably all of it.
And then Dorian Gray, so it moves into Oscar Wilde,
Yes.
who was probably present a little bit in the other series as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I was always fascinated by Oscar Wilde, and the fact that Oscar Wilde was, of Irish descent. Through his style and his wit, he managed to kind of progress through kind of British society. And unfortunately, he was brought down because of his sexuality. And I've also always been fascinated by the picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
Because the picture of Dorian Gray is really about, mortality, really. And, and in terms of my own body and my own mortality and my own sort of disability, I've always found, like, the picture of Dorian Gray a really kind of fascinating, story. And I wanted to sort of explore the idea that this, young man, kind of stayed forever young.
Yeah.
Throughout the story. But then because of his pact with the devil, he dies at the end. But then he was kind of, he had a friend who kind of corrupted him.
Yeah.
And
it's always someone else's fault.
Yeah, so and so this is my kind of recreation of that, of that story.
Yeah. I think before we open it up to questions from the audience, there's one last question which the Dorian Gray piece really, I think, highlights is the role of your work in kind of questioning art itself and the role of art, because obviously this is about a person and their representation in a painting. Yeah. And a lot of your work goes through narratives of art history to recontextualize them, reframe them, and possibly also question them.
Yeah,
accepted norms that maybe are taught in schools, at art schools, or received wisdom, this idea that someone says it's good, so it's good. I wonder how conscious you are when you're making work of being part of this history, and also, I mean, now that you're an established artist who presumably is being taught in art schools in the same way as those artists you questioned in your early work, how does that feel? Does that feel weird, different, good, bad?
No, I mean, I think that, the job of the next generation of artists is to actually subvert my own work, and I'm quite happy with that, I think that, artists should always question.
Yeah. And
they should always question what went before. And I think that's the kind of, that's the idea of, I guess, progress, and we're moving on. Like, they don't have to necessarily accept, what I'm doing. I mean, they have to, they have to be independent. They have to think about, things from their perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, things will be very different in the future with the sort of, Instagram generation.
Yeah, of course.
It's a whole different approach to practice. Yeah.
And are you interested in what younger artists are doing?
No, absolutely. Actually, I have, I have a residency. I have a project space in my studio that I've run for about 10 years. And, so the artists, they send in proposals and they get the space for a month. And it's usually group shows. And then so they can make work and then show it, in the space. And then I've also just, I'm building an artist residency space in Lagos, Nigeria. And my foundation has just been registered, which is great.
Oh, congratulations.
And then I will be able to bring artists, because I want to create sort of international exchange, because too often people come from Africa to the West but a lot of people are very ignorant about Africa.
Yeah.
And there are people who want to go, but they don't have a way to go. So that's why I'm building this residency space. It's going to, I mean, I can only have 3 artists at a time, but there'll be, space to work and a bedroom, to stay. And then people can do up to residencies of up to about 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's a project. I mean, we finished the foundation, and then we're just about to kind of finish. So hopefully in about 18 months, we'll finish the building. And then I will be collaborating with individuals and institutions who want to actually support artists.
Yeah.
And the artists will be coming from everywhere. They'll be from within Africa itself, other parts of Africa. There'll be, UK, Japan, US, Germany, anywhere. And so, but I want to create a structure in which institutions or individuals might say, okay, I want to support like 10 artists this year to do the residency. And they'll support them with what they need, whatever. So that's one of my big projects I'm working on at the moment.
That's amazing. So if there are any questions from the audience, if you raise your hand, I think there's a mic coming around, and feel free to apply for residencies.
No, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, that's sort of one way, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, I think that I've always liked, like, politically engaging art that's aesthetically pleasing. So I would, and I would cut across to, say, music, for example. I mean, when Marvin Gaye did his album, What's Going On? Incredibly political album that his record company actually didn't want him to put out at all, because it was just so kind of politically kind of dangerous in a way. But then it's fantastic music. It's like absolutely incredible. And another artist, Fela Kuti, which is another African artist, musician, very, very political lyrics and everything. But formally, it's second to none. And so in a way, that's kind of where I'm kind of looking at. So it's not just to entertain you, but it's to also make you think. But then if the structure that you're hanging that on is not, is not professional, like you have to be formally, you have to be at the top of your game. It doesn't matter what you're trying to talk about. And so I guess that's what I meant by kind of, that the work is kind of formally kind of, sound, but then it's also really meaningful. Not specifically about that, but I mean, the reason I'm actually building the residency space in Lagos is to have, because I'm very serious about that cultural exchange. And particularly, there are many Africans within the diaspora, African Americans, British Africans, who would really love to go to Africa, but they've not had the opportunity to do that. and also English people, all kind of races really. But I think that that would be the main reason why I'm actually making that kind of investment on the ground there, to create a kind of, to create platforms, because there will also be, curators as well as writers, as well as, and to do that on the continent of Africa is actually something I find, very, very important to do. So, and I think that some of those issues you talked about connection with heritage and self-esteem, I'm hoping that, on the ground, I will be able to start to make those kind of global kind of networks, actually on the continent itself. There's the issue of, I talked earlier about taking control of one's image, and also, a good example of that is, I was awarded an MBE, and I've just recently been awarded a CBE. And both times, people have said that I should have refused those awards. I shouldn't have accepted because of colonialism, because of empire. And I feel very strongly that actually, no, I should accept, because historically, if we actually want to change, if we want to change things, then we have to be at the table. We cannot, I cannot perennially be the other, who is, I have to feel that I'm accepted by society. I have to feel that I can affect change. And it was the same when I was invited to the Royal Academy. I accepted, and I'm now, at the Royal Academy. And since I've been at the Royal Academy, I think I've been able to make positive contributions towards diversity of the Royal Academy. And I think we have to take positions of power if we are going to change anything. And also, I don't actually think that people want to discriminate against us generally. I think sometimes it might just be as simple as, I don't know any black people, because you're not at the table. So, and I think that, it's actually, so, the question of respectability or self-esteem or whatever, we have to participate. And I don't want to position myself as the other forever. So that's why I refuse this idea that I should have turned down the CBE. No, I mean, absolutely. There are works I've made. I've made a series of sculptures, referring to it. And I've also, in fact, the picture of Dorian Gray is really about disability. That's what that work's about. But it's also very important to note that every human being is kind of complex. So, yeah, I may be an artist with a disability, but I'm also a black artist, and I'm also a British Nigerian artist. So I think I explore all the different aspects of my identity in my work, and I don't shy away from any of them, and I visibly explore all of them. So sometimes, one aspect of my personality or identity will come out in one work. In another work, it may not, or another aspect may come out. But I take the point that I do include that in some of my works, because it's also some of my identity, not all of my identity. Yeah.
I was going to say, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.